In the next series of lectures, we're going to be going through the step-by-step process that you need to be using as you translate ordinary language arguments into standard form categorical syllogisms. And you want to make sure you take really careful notes of the steps we go through here and the order that we go through these steps. You also want to take note of anything that I offer you as a pointer to help you do this translation work successfully. So if you don't have something to write with and write on, go ahead and pause your video, get those things, and then when you're ready to rock and roll, go ahead and restart your video. All right, so let's take a look at our argument that we're going to work with here. Diseases carried by recessive genes can be inherited by offspring of two carriers. Thus, since cystic fibrosis is a disease carried by recessive genes, it can be inherited by the offspring of two carriers. The very first thing we're going to do in our translation work is we are going to look for the conclusion and the premise statements, okay? And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to look for indicator words. We're going to look for premise indicators and conclusion indicators. When we look at this argument here, I see a couple of indicator words. I see a premise indicator and a conclusion indicator. Do you? Thus and since. Thus is a conclusion indicator. It tells us that the statement that follows is a conclusion, and since is a premise indicator, telling us that the statement that follows it is a premise. Now, what's interesting about this argument is that we have a conclusion indicator, thus, followed immediately by a premise indicator. And that can make it a little tricky to identify the conclusion. The conclusion is the statement that comes after that premise. Okay, so we have a premise that's been embedded here between the conclusion indicator and the conclusion statement itself. So we want to make sure that the first thing we do is we identify that conclusion. We want to put it at the bottom of our argument so that we can stack the premises on top of the conclusion and get ourselves closer and closer and closer to a standard form categorical syllogism. Now we want to identify our premise statements. I don't care what order the premises are at this point. So I'm just going to go up here, and I know that this first statement has to be a premise statement because there's a conclusion indicator thus right here, and that tells me that not only is the statement that follows a conclusion, but the statement that precedes thus, or any conclusion indicator, is a premise. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put that statement at the top of my argument, and then I can see here that I've got my second premise right here after this premise indicator, and I can put that statement as my second premise. Whoops, stay there. Okay, so now I have my premises and conclusion statements identified, and I can move on to step number 2.